Well, hi everyone. This is Scott King over at Eds Imperium, and thanks for joining me this afternoon for our PSD2 compliance on mobile devices. So, a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today is what are the mandates for mobile devices, and then how does it apply to either your service, your APIs, your customers, all pertaining to the end mobile device. We're going to talk a little bit about jailbreak versus compromise detection, how vulnerable the mobile operating systems are. I'm really focusing on iOS today because I get most of the questions for iOS. And then how to mitigate compromises for the compliance. I'm going to go through the exact strong customer authentication requirements and the regulatory standards and kind of walk you through what the law says and then what that means to you as a mobile app development situation. And then when to implement app shielding and mobile threat defense. So we get a lot of questions about those two differences, so I want to walk you through that and answer any questions that you may have. But on some of the material, you may have a question as I'm speaking to it and I can't hear you. So if you would please type your question into the Q&A window at the top. If you don't see it, you should, you can scroll to the edge of the screen and then just type your question in and I'll get to those at the end. More than likely, one question will be applicable to all of us. So please send in a question and I'll get to those at the end and let's get going. So first of all, I want to really give you an idea of how we got here. And the commission delegated regulation, and the one that we're talking about today is EU 2018/389, which is in the November 2017 timeframe. And really, this supplemented another directive in 2015, which was PSD2. And the council, what they did is basically establish all of these regulatory technical standards for strong customer authentication. And the whole thing was really because mobile devices have taken over, right? So the first payment services directive, the language said nothing about mobile devices, but as the devices became more and more prevalent and more services, banking services, civil services, all types of location, just count the number of apps that are on your mobile devices. Those are just so pervasive that the council had to rewrite all of these initiatives and really talking about mobile devices. And what they really state about mobile devices is that as you provide a mobile app, you really cannot control the health of that end point, right? Your consumer's mobile endpoint, you really can't control the health of that. And that's what a lot of the language talks about in the directives. And that's what I'm going to, explain to you today. And should they be concerned? Well, they should be concerned because if you think about the timeline of the mobile operating systems, they're relatively young, right? They still evolve. There's all types of features that get added, month over month, and there's all types of bugs that get registered inside these inside the same mobile operating system. So with iOS, what I did was I took a look at the CVEs that were registered in the last 18 months. So from 2018 to April 2019. And you can see that, a large majority of these are pretty severe. They have CVE scores of 6+, right? So more than half of them do. So, some of the bugs are more severe than others, but when you look at all the critical ones, so 72% of the critical CVEs allowed code injection, right? So of all the CVEs, 62% were critical, but then, almost 3/4 of these allowed some type of code to be injected into the operating system. And that's multiple vectors. That could be through SMS, that could be through the browser. Browser code injections are really popular. And if you take a look at the list. So that's what we're really talking about is, even if you build a strong mobile app, it's only as strong as the foundation that it's built upon, right? So you have to cover those types of scenarios in PSD2 and for the strong customer authentication. So you need to make sure and look at that. And if you want a list of these CVEs, I can give you the exact list later. But since there are so many iOS vulnerabilities to allow an attacker to execute code or inject some code, you can find stories all over the place about how the walled garden is secure, but yet a lot of security researchers urge Apple to change the security culture. One of the most famous bugs this year was in the was it late January, early February timeframe, was the group FaceTime. That bug was so severe, it forced Apple to remove the entire feature from the system. So they pushed it out, and then the next version, that feature was just gone. So if you didn't use it, you didn't lose it. But for people that were, in and doing research in the operating system, it was pretty severe for Apple just to remove an entire feature out of the next version. So, so things like that do happen. And really, why it's important is, and I want to read this statement because it's pretty powerful, and I want you to think about who may have said this. So the devices you carry not only contain personal emails, health information, and photos, but also are the conduits to corporations, infrastructure, and other critical services. So this is vital infrastructure like power grids and transportation hubs. They become more vulnerable when an individual device gets hacked. So criminals and terrorists want to infiltrate systems and disrupt sensitive networks may start their attacks by accessing just one person's smartphone. So if one person is going to create, the vulnerability for your entire corporation, that's pretty powerful. So, take a second, think about who said this, and if you said Apple said this, then you were correct. So, Apple, when they were providing statements to the Parliamentary Joint Committee in Australia on a telecommunications bill, this was inside their statement. So they said, this is very, very important to cover the operating system. So a little bit about bank malware. And a lot of people say, well, I use two-factor authentication, and the malware is not going to take effect. Well, sophisticated versions of the bank bot malware over the last couple of years have actually been able to capture two-factor authentication. So they'll grab the text codes being sent to end users and just capture those over the air and then use those in the web interface. So, it's not an iOS or Android only. It's basically the vulnerabilities in all the infrastructure that we use to communicate with. So this operating system is the SS7. If you do any telco research, it's SMS, right? You can deliver payloads via SMS and phish people like that. So not iOS only. And it's not malware only, but Gartner says that malware will constitute 30% of all malware this year. So think about that. If there's 100 malware, 30 of them are on mobile. That's surprising. And they go on to say in the market guide for application shielding is vendors like Imperium will supply in-app SDKs, which kind of supplement what you're doing for application shielding. So we're going to cover that a little bit later in our checklist. So I've got a checklist for you that you can follow on the end. So yeah, but Scott, I'm an app development shop, and I do everything to secure my APIs, my data. I do obfuscation. I do all the things that I'm supposed to be doing. But this survey amongst Fortune 500 IT development shops, this is from the Verizon Mobile Security Index of this year. So they asked everyone that filled out the survey, do you or don't you build your own apps? So 70% of the people that filled out this survey, they do build their own app. And of those 70%, 53% of them aren't even real firm on their building a secure application. So are you concerned about insecure coding? 53 of them, yes, I am concerned about my own ability to push out a mobile app. It's pretty scary. So you're either, I guess you're either 47 or 53, you decide. But, it is a viable, it's a viable vector, right? So 70% of fraud originated in a mobile browser or in a mobile app. So this comes from RSA, their risk intelligence service. They put out a report last year, and you can see through the years how mobile browsers and mobile apps actually attribute to fraudulent transactions. And last quarter, it was 70%, so quite a bit. So if you're not looking for fraud in that channel, you're looking for, you're not finding what you're not really vulnerable to. So be aware of that. And so what can happen? So obviously these things can happen. This Tesco example is fairly famous because the hackers actually used the mobile app to break into the backend system. And the hackers were able to overnight steal only 2.5 million pounds of customers' money over about 9,000 accounts. But the fine for actually, failing to exercise due skill and care and diligence in protecting its current, the account holder data, it was, it's 6 times what the hackers stole. So quite a severe penalty by not securing and doing best practices around mobile app development. So definitely an example that we talk about here. And then British Airways last year, intruders captured 380,000 credit card numbers from users booking travel via the mobile app and the website. So this was an interesting case because the same vulnerability was used in lots of different mobile apps and not lots of different websites. But British Airways, unfortunately, was one of the companies that took the biggest hit with the data. The hackers actually captured the CVV data as well from the credit card. So kind of leads you to believe that they captured that data over the air and they didn't break into a database. So this was a vulnerability amongst all the interoperable systems. So if you had data from a attacked mobile app, what would it look like? So it'd look like this, or some depiction of this. So this data represents mobile threat events by week for an SDK customer, right? So they're using mobile threat defense as a software development kit. It's embedded into their mobile app, and basically this data is generated from their consumers, right? So since I don't have control of the health of that consumer app, really what's going on out there. And this is a mobile bank application, and what really surprised them was the level of security that they had in the mobile app with all the fraud and all the authentication, yet they still found that the health of the customer devices was very, very poor. Lots of vulnerable devices, they're not being updated, they don't have the latest security patches, they have malware, they got bad applications, they're rooted, they're jailbroken. There's abnormal processes running in here. There's no passcodes, there's no encryption. They have developer and USB debugging on, and that's just the static risk, right? And then if you look at the day-to-day, network events, they're using bad networks, and those bad networks are attacking, ARP tables, and there's suspicious networks all of the time. And obviously these devices are being scanned by their equipment, but there are people out there looking for vulnerable endpoints, and they're going to find them. There's a study a couple of weeks ago, forget who it was. I think Sophos put out a report on cloud honeypots. So they activated several cloud honeypots and found that they were attacked 52 seconds later. So there are bots out there looking for your vulnerable endpoints, and hopefully you will secure your mobile endpoints with with this new directive that's coming September 2019. So get ready. You got 5 months. So the data that I showed you earlier was from a mobile banking app, and what the bank tells us that it helps them aid in $1.1 billion. This is a U.S. bank, so it's dollars, via the mobile channel. So just in 30 days, they found 1,200 completely compromised devices. They wouldn't have seen this otherwise because they can't identify a compromised operating system. They're only controlling their own app. So with the SDK, you get that next level of visibility. 3,000 compromised networks. That's probably no surprise. It was surprising the number of jailbroken and rooted devices that were actually operating their app, and then 2,200 malicious apps. So with the SDK, we do identify malicious apps and malware differently on the different platforms. So if you have a question about that, I can get to that at the end. So here's why we're here today. So what I'm going to walk you through is 2018/389, specifically Articles 6 through 9 on strong customer authentication and the technical standards. So that's what really applies to mobile devices. In first, what it says is I'm actually going to take a look at my notes because this is very, very detailed. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read this. I've read it quite a few times, and I keep referring back to it. So if you do have, if you want to link to the exact paragraphs that I am discussing, I'll put these slides online as soon as we're done, and I've got all the notes down there. But I'm going to skip down to what pertains to as knowledge. So in strong customer authentication, you have to have knowledge, and your customer has to have the same level of knowledge. What the requirements of the elements say is that payment service providers shall adopt measures to mitigate the risk that the elements of strong customer authentication categorized as knowledge are uncovered by or disclosed to unauthorized parties. So this is something that I know, like my PIN number, or a code that you send me, a second authentication code. So as we saw in the BankBot example, BankBot was able to capture that over the air. Like, you would have to mitigate the risk of that happening. So you need to make sure that no man in the middle attack or anything is happening between you and your user. It goes on to say that the use by the payer of those elements shall be subject to mitigation measures. So you have to be able to, one, detect it, that it is happening, and then two, if you detect it, you have to be able to mitigate it. So we can all mitigate if we know about it, but we have to figure out how to get that knowledge. All right, and then possession, right? So the article also states on strong customer authentication the requirements for possession. So this has to be something that I have. And so what it does in the regulation, it talks about multi-use devices, and then it'll say, for example, tablets or mobile phones. What they do is they interchange multi-use and phone and tablet. So a lot of times, I'm just talking about the mobile platforms, but it's any multi-use device. So payment service providers shall adopt measures to mitigate the risk that the elements of strong customer authentication categorized possession are used by unauthorized parties. So if I am inside of your device, and I can do this with a Trojan, there's actually guys that will actually sell rootkits, and they can spy on phones all over the world. So you have to be able to detect and mitigate that. So be sure that no one is getting into your device. So adopt measures to mitigate that risk of that happening. So you don't want a defender to come in and steal the ball away from you when you're being attacked, right? And then Inherence. So this is the requirements of devices and software linked to the elements categorized as inherence. And basically that just means that we're pretty sure that we know each other, right? That no one is inside our device taking a look at our communication. So payment service providers shall adopt measures to mitigate the risk that the authentication elements categorized as inherence and read by access devices are provided to the payer. You can't have these uncovered by other parties. And what it says, at a minimum, the payment service providers shall ensure that these access devices and software, so that's the device itself and the operating system software, they're being authenticated together, right? And you can't have a third party be in there. So the use by the payer of those elements shall be subject to measures ensuring that those devices and software guarantee resistance against unauthorized use of the elements through the access of the devices and the software. I don't know how you guarantee resistance. You could probably do as much as you could, but no guarantee. So we'll see what the lawyers argue about that. And then I think the most interesting one is independence of the articles, right? So this is Article 9, and it's titled Independence of the Elements. And what it says is, the compromise of one can't compromise the second one. And if you think about mobile payments, and you are initiating the payment on the same mobile device that you're receiving the second layer of authentication, that's exactly what it's talking about. So a compromised mobile device does compromise two elements. So this, if you have a mobile payment app, and you are initiating payments with the app, and then you're authenticating, in your app on the same device, then this applies to every single one of you. So it's pretty scary. So you must secure an execution environment like runtime application. So this is your runtime application self-protection. This is your app shielding. Our SDK does this as well because we're detecting the real-time attacks and the compromises. So you must use something like this in Article 9, Section A. You can take a look at that. And then you must install mechanisms to ensure that the software is not altered by a third party. And so what this really means in the paragraph B is, can you detect a compromised mobile device or operating system, right? Can you detect it? And if you can, as we talked about earlier, you must mitigate that, right? So you have to know about that. So pretty scary stuff. And then, if alterations take place, you must have mechanisms to mitigate the consequences. So, if your app or your customer's mobile device is altered by a third party, as the law states, you must mitigate that compromise. So in order to mitigate it, you have to be looking for something like that. So it's a pretty easy fix. It takes 10 minutes or so. And what you would do is you would install a small SDK in both your iOS and Android app. And on the left-hand side, what we're doing is this lists the route to compromise. So if I'm a sophisticated hacker, or if I'm a novice, I can get into these devices. Our data indicates that people are not using very good security hygiene, especially over the networks, right? So I can get into your device over the network. Any type of malicious processes and activity, we're going to detect and report back to you so you can mitigate. The health of your devices, encryption, pins, side-loaded apps, any types of operating system vulnerability, or actually make you aware of the operating system version that your customer is running, and you can make decisions based on that. And in the middle here, it says app tampering, or this is your app shielding. There's a lot of overlap from what the app shielding technologies are doing and what we're doing with the in-app protection SDK. So it's you can use both. You can use one or the other. App shielding by itself will not detect the operating system compromised by a third party. So just be aware that if you're only doing app shielding, you're not actually complying to all the regulations. And then I've listed some mitigation examples here on the right-hand side. These are just these are examples of any type of mitigations that you can do locally, right? You can deny the user being able to use your mobile channel. You can shove them to the web channel to make sure that that they're being authenticated. You can increase their user risk scores, push them to a VPN. Any type of custom rules that maybe your fraud department would like to take a look at, you can locally remediate from any of the activity that is on the left-hand side. So if you have questions about this, then please let me know, and we'll get you an exact answer. So how do I get this into my device? And this is really the summary of my presentation today. So if you do have a question, just let me know in the Q&A window above, and I'll get to you at the end. So what we do is we'll supply you with an administration console, and the administration console would allow you to download the code, set up users. Like if you have several apps, then you would have several development users, administration users. This is where all the documentation is. It's very self-contained. If you log in, you know, you probably can get this whole process done in about a day. So it does show 4 steps. This is not a long process. You would then install and, you know, configure the threat detection SDK. You'd install that into your app and compile that code, upload it to the App Store, and you're done. Your customers will automatically get the new version of your app. They won't see a change. So when they open their app, the SDK is completely invisible to them. So there's no user help questions, anything like that, unless you start pushing alerts to them or anything like that. That would be the only user change. And then in the administration panel, you can take a look at all the mobile threat events. You can look for patterns. You can look for you know, what's happening to the end users, and you can make decisions based on that data once you start collecting it. So really, we're going to help you collect the data so you can detect and then mitigate all those risks as pertaining to the PSD2 initiative, which is September 14. So you guys got to get busy. So if you're looking at some of the items that are in the regulation, on the left-hand side talks about data protection, secure communications, MIDMs, obfuscation. You can look at this list. You know, there's a little overlap with the app shielding and our SDK, which is called ZApp. It's Imperium in-app protection. And then I just listed the sandbox. Somebody asked me earlier that, you know, am I covered with the operating system? Well, yes, you are covered with the sandbox and the encryption when data is at rest, but the problem is a user cannot read encrypted data. So at some point in time, there's plain text visible to the user. You have to be able to protect that situation as well. So there are instances, you can read articles in the news where, you know, people have actually captured text from devices that, you know, were inside end-to-end encrypted apps, but however, you know, a human can't read encrypted data. So at some point in time, it's plain text. So you have to be able to cover that as well. If you'd like this checklist, I'll send this out for you. You can pass this around to your teams. And then if you have any other questions, you can send me a direct email. If you don't want to ask the question in the public forum, then no problem. Send me an email. So I am king@zimperium.com, Scott King. And there's more information available on our in-app protection page. And I've supplied a link there. And obviously, I'll give you these slides whenever I put them into PDF, which should be later today. So, questions. If anybody has a question, please type it in. One question that I always get is how big the SDK is. It's small. You know, it's 10 megs. It's a little bit bigger for Android because we are able to actually look for malware on Android a little bit differently since you're allowed to see the other apps in the system. So we have a way to look at unseen malware, right? So we can detect malware that hasn't been labeled malware as of yet. Can you give me some examples of customers using this? Yes, I can give you examples. Some are, I can't give you any brand names because I'll get in trouble, but if you email me, I will tell you who is using this. And then yes, I will send out the slides. I'll send out the slides and I'll put them on I'll put them on Twitter and LinkedIn so you can grab them there as well. Okay, looks like that is all the questions. If you have any others, please give me an email. Otherwise, I will look forward to talking with you a little bit later in between now and September 14th. So thanks a lot for joining me this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.